With any chapter of history, I think a teacher should always ask, how can I try to present this material in a way that will be relevant to students? How can it make them understand where we've been, where we are, and where we're going? And with the Adams-Onis Treaty, I really struggled for a long time. I was like, how can I present this part of history in a way that at least I can try to make it relevant for students? And the best theme that I could come up with is the Adams-Onis Treaty is part of history that shows how the United States came to be as a country, if that makes sense, right? Like, how did this land that was first inhabited by Native Americans and then claimed by Europeans, how did it eventually become this organization of 50 states? What's the history of how this country came to be? And the Adams-Onis Treaty shows us a little bit about how that was. So that's the reason why I think this is kind of an important chapter of history to study. So it involves a whole cast of characters. John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State under President James Monroe, a Spanish ambassador named Louis de Onis, and perhaps most famously, Andrew Jackson, who was then a military commander. So, a little bit about John Quincy Adams. He will become the sixth president of the United States, the son of President John Adams. He was a committed nationalist and an experienced diplomat. John Quincy Adams was someone who, in 1817, viewed the possibility of a country that stretched from ocean to ocean. Because in 1817, the United States is still just this area here with these darkened orange states. You can see this is still territory purchased by the United States in the Louisiana Purchase, but this area um, doesn't include states like Nebraska or North or South Dakota, right? It's still just territory, again, inhabited by Native Americans. And John Quincy Adams was also an experienced diplomat. He, several years earlier, um, negotiated something called the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which demilitarized the Great Lakes for the Revolutionary War to the War of 1812. The United States and Great Britain were like bad neighbors that constantly got into arguments along the frontier and along the border, so there would be disputes. And the Rush-Bagot Treaty helped to lessen those disputes because you couldn't put warships or as many warships on the Great Lakes. So he is an experienced diplomat with a vision for expanding the US territory. So the Adams-Onis Treaty has its origins on Seminole Native Americans who were continuing raids on U.S. settlers in the Southwest. Seminoles were a Native American tribe in Florida, like Florida State Seminoles, and they would often come into conflict with U.S. settlers on the Southwest for all kinds of reasons, of course, right? Like these are settlers that are trampling on territory. Again, these are neighbors that don't get along. So the Seminole raids would occur in some of these states. A lot of uh, slaves who escaped their masters in states like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi would often flee to Florida, where they would often live with Native Americans. So there's these constant raids, and President James Monroe knows that he needs to do something about it. So he instructs his Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, to send an order to Jackson to, quote, stop the raids. There's a lot of questions, though, about this order because Andrew Jackson will not only just stop the raids, he will actually go on to invade West Florida and East Florida. He will be victorious in his wars with the Seminoles. This will basically put all of Florida under the control of the United States. Was Andrew Jackson supposed to do that? He didn't have explicit instructions to do that. He did it anyway. John Quincy Adams was glad that he did because he took that as an opportunity, again, as a committed nationalist, to put all of Florida under U.S. control. So he enters into negotiations with Louis de Onis and Louis de Onis, I think that's how it's pronounced. But basically, all of Florida will become part of the United States. By the way, Jacksonville, right, is named for Andrew Jackson. Didn't know that until I studied this chapter of history. Um, After the raids at St. Mark's and Pensacola, again from Andrew Jackson, Louis de Onis knew that Florida couldn't be kept by the Spanish. So Florida will be put under U.S. control, and Spain will also relinquish control of all lands north of the 42nd parallel up here. This was, again, territory that was claimed by many countries, including Spain. But the Adams-Onis Treaty, in addition to Florida becoming part of the U.S., even though it wouldn't be a state yet, it's going to set the boundary here, along where this cursor is going, between the United States and Spain. This is going to include areas like Texas, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. Again, this is areas that belonged to Spain at the time, but it's going to set this boundary between these two countries. So it's kind of like drawing a line in the sand, right? When you say, like, this is mine and this is yours. Well, this is territory, again, inhabited by Native Americans. We can't forget that. But which these two countries are arguing over and fighting over. So this boundary is going to become important because later on, it's going to have an impact on the Mexican-American War. It's going to have an impact also too on areas that are going to become slave states and free states. And it's just, again, part of this chapter of U.S. history where, as it continues to move westward, what were the agreements? What were the conflicts? What were the wars that would eventually lead to the United States becoming this country from coast to coast?